And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing improving conditions slowly here in the west, especially out along the coast. So the winds really drop off and the snow and blowing snow ease back, but still pretty windy with areas of snow and blowing snow. And winter storm warnings continuing all the way up to the western Arctic coast with some wind advisories. Increasing wind, rain and snow, northeast Bristol Bay trying to push into the southern Kuskokwim Valley. But some of that sliding up the eastern slopes of the western Alaska Range, increasing light snow for the North Gulf Coast. And next system bringing a mixture of precipitation into the Aleutians, pushing up toward the Pribilofs later on. Stays windy and cold across the southeast coast and cold over the interior. And that holds through tomorrow, though increasing clouds here over the central part of the state, actually the Tanana Valley northward, maybe some clouds all the way up to the Yukon Flats, but clear conditions continue with breezy winds at higher elevations here all the way to the Arctic coast. Arctic coast a little windier than the west side here as this front weakens and the winds and blowing snow diminish to the next system coming northward, bringing more heavy wind and rain into the Alaska Peninsula area. And for Saturday, pretty strong low pulls into the southeast Bering Sea with strong southeast winds across Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula, and even stronger northwest winds or northwest and northwest winds for the eastern Aleutian areas with colder air coming in on those winds. And look for pretty good snow in that area. Numerous snow showers for the Pribilofs, actually covering much of the Bering Sea here, all the way up to the Bering Strait. Chance of snow increases here over the southeast interior areas, as well as the Panhandle. Rain and snow for the North Gulf Coast, southern Kenai Peninsula to Kodiak Island. And for the coastal water forecast, south coast of the Panhandle, east winds 15 to 20 knots for Friday. East-southeast of 15 for the central coast and the north coast, east winds 15 to 20 knots. Lynn Canal, much lighter winds tomorrow, down to 10 knots out of the north, northeast 15 with higher gusts for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, north winds 15 knots. First day of the weekend here, Prince of Wales Island along the west coast there, east winds of 15 knots. Otherwise, central coast, southeast at 25 knots and east-southeast winds 20 to 25 knots for the north coast. North at 15 for Lynn Canal, Stevens Passage, southeast winds 15 knots, and Clarence Strait, east winds at 15 knots. Eastern North Gulf Coast, east winds 25 to 30 knots, about the same for Prince William Sound. Winds out of the east tomorrow at 25 knots. Northeast winds 20 to 30 knots, strongest south of the Forelands. Then we've got storm warnings for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands for east winds at 50 knots with 15 to 19-foot seas. Those fall back to gales on Saturday, becoming southeast at 35 knots for the Barren Islands, east 35 for Kamishak Bay. No change for Cook Inlet, northeast winds 20 to 30 knots. Prince William Sound for first day of the weekend, winds will be east at 20 knots. 25-knot easterlies for the western North Gulf Coast, and there for the western coast, east at 20. Kodiak Island, Friday, south winds 25 to 30 knots. And south to southeast winds, 25 to 35 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. Gale warnings for Bristol Bay, southeast winds 35 knots. And those gales hold through Saturday. Southeast 35 knots for Bristol Bay for the Alaska Peninsula. South to southwest winds 35 to 40 knots. Kodiak Island, south to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the western Aleutians, northwest winds 30 to 40 knots. Adak and Atka, good gales there, northwest 45 knots. And for the Fox Islands, south to southeast winds 30 to 35 knots. And for Saturday, eastern Aleutians here, west winds 40 to 50 knots with seas approaching 20 feet. And Adak and Atka, gale warnings, west winds 35 knots. Western Aleutians, west to southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. And for the southwest coast, St. Lawrence Island, tomorrow, southeast winds 30 knots. And south 15 there for St. Matthew Island, Pribilof, southeast winds 20 knots. And Norton Sound, east winds at 40 knots. Gales continue for Norton Sound, but a little lighter though, east at 35 knots for Saturday. St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta coast, east winds at 30 knots. Gales continue here for the, or gale warnings for the Kuskokwim Delta coastline, south of Nunivak Island. East winds of 40 knots, west winds 35 knots for St. Matthew Island, northwest winds 45 knots for the Pribilof Islands with seas right around 20 feet. And for the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, east to southeast winds 40 knots. Gale warnings for the central and eastern Arctic coast, easterly winds at 35 to 40 knots. And looking ahead to Saturday, looking at storm force easterlies here for the area around Barter Island, the demarcation point. Otherwise 45 knot winds as you head west, drop off to about 40 knots there for the central Arctic coast, 30 knots for the western Arctic coast and the Chukchi Sea. For Saturday, winds will be east, 25 to 35 knots.